Okay, so okay. Welcome, good afternoon and welcome. Before we begin, I would like to introduce the History Department's Speaker Committee, Natalie Garza, Marjorie Brown, Lauren Kerr-Harrelly, John Harrington, and yours truly, Angela Holder. The committee's work has been made possible by our chair, Dr. Gisela Abels, and our dean, Dr. Theodore Hanley. We also thank our colleagues for attending and spreading the word about our events. Our speaker series this year covered topics from the hippies, women in religion, American conservatism, and our last scheduled talk on the Sugar Land 95. One of my colleagues said local is history, and this presentation epitomizes that theme. On February 18, 2018, construction workers uncovered a set of remains at the site of a new Fort Bend ISD campus. After halting work and sending the bones for forensic analysis, the school district called on the Texas State Historical Commission and an archaeology firm. They found the remains of 95 individuals who had become known as the Sugar Land 95, all victims of the convict lease system in Texas. Our presenters today are Dr. Teresa Jack and Dr. Helen Graham. Dr. Teresa Jack received her master's and doctorate from the University of Houston. She is a history professor at Houston Community College. She has co-edited and contributed to Incarcerated Women, a history of struggles, oppression, and resistance in American prisons. She has published 2 books for Arcadia Press, Huntsville Penitentiary in Richmond, Texas, with Clinton Drake. She and Dr. Graham recently contributed to Back to Bondage, Forced Labor in Post-Reconstruction Era Texas. Dr. Graham was a non-commissioned officer, professional military graduate. She went on to receive a Master's of Liberal Arts from the University of St. Thomas, then a doctorate in educational leadership at Sam Houston State University. She is working on a graduate certificate in digital public humanities, which centers on the Sugar Land 95 at George Mason University. Dr. Graham was awarded the Innovation of the Year award for her work on the Z degree plan at HCC and the National Institute for Staff and Organizational Development Teaching Excellence Award. She is the current chair of Humanities, Philosophy, and Library Services. Today, Dr. Jack is going to discuss some background information on convict leasing in Texas, and in particular, Fort Bend County. Dr. Graham will then discuss more detailed information about the search for the identities of the Sugar Land 95 and tell the stories of some of the individuals victimized by this brutal system. And without further ado, Dr. Jack.
Thank you, Angela. I'm going to share my screen, I think. There we go. Can we see it?
Yes, there it is. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So today we're going to look at convict leasing and the Sugar Land 95. And as Professor Cooper mentioned in the introduction, in February of 2018, at the construction site for a Fort Bend ISD campus, construction workers uncovered the first set of remains that would turn out to be the victims of the convict lease system, and they're going to be known as the Sugar Land 95. They were working in Fort Bend County during the height of convict leasing. So convict leasing, and basically that's just renting out prisoners for labor. And it addresses 3 issues in Texas at the time and really across the South. First of all, it meets the demand for labor that white landowners wanted. They wanted a labor force that they could coerce, like they had under slavery. And second, the prison in Huntsville is really small and dilapidated after the Civil War, and it isn't big enough to actually fit the number of prisoners that are coming in. And third, the state of Texas really needs money after the Civil War. They don't have money to maintain or fix the prison. So the prison in Huntsville was built in 1849, and by the time we get to the end of the Civil War, it's really small and falling apart. So this is an image from 1866. It's right inside the walls of the prison, and you can see prisoners on the left there lined up and kind of in the center. So that's right after the Civil War. And it was designed originally just to hold white prisoners because enslaved people were punished on the plantations, and they actually rarely made it into the formal criminal justice system. But after the Civil War, there's a dramatic increase in the number of arrests and convictions of African Americans, and they are being targeted by newly passed laws that are really designed to control their labor. So some examples, there's a vagrancy statute in Texas that makes it illegal to not have a job. And for African American men and women, their job had to be working for a white landowner in some sort of agricultural labor. And if they weren't, they were arrested for vagrancy. Other quite ridiculous laws that Black people were arrested for: speaking loudly in front of a white woman, walking on railroad tracks. And another example here in Houston is that there were a group of African American men that were selling smoked meat off of push carts downtown, and white restaurant owners didn't like the competition. And so Houston City Council passed a law making it illegal to sell food off of a push cart, and all of those men were arrested for vagrancy, even though they had been supporting themselves and their families. And if you're arrested for vagrancy and you can't pay your fine, then you are auctioned off to the highest bidder and you work for free until all the fines and interest are paid off. Now, other example of crimes that were sending Black Texans to the penitentiary. And also there were children as young as 10 in the Huntsville prison. They're housed with adults. Most of them are in for petty theft. One man was sentenced to 2 years for stealing 5 cents, another for taking half a plug of tobacco, and one man was given a 7-year sentence for stealing an orange. Another man convicted for theft when he took some wool out of the garbage and made a pair of socks out of them, and they arrested him for theft and sent him to prison. Now, in Texas and the rest of the South, there's no money really to maintain the penitentiaries or repair them. And so some counties began experimenting using convicts to work on roads and in chain gangs. So I'll show you a couple of images. This is from North Carolina, and those prisoners are being held in these railroad carts while they work on railroads. And then we have a street gang of convict labor, and this is in Alabama. So public works, like working on streets and things, would never provide enough labor for all of the convicts. And so Texas starts to experiment with convict leasing in 1867, but there's a lot of debate about whether it was actually legal or not to do this. And then we have a court case in 1871, and this is Ruffin v. Commonwealth. It comes out of the Supreme Court in the state of Virginia. And in this case, we have a convict named Woody Ruffin, and he kills another convict while he's out on a chain gang. And he is tried and convicted and sentenced to death by the prison. He's going to appeal that death sentence, arguing that he has a constitutional right to be tried in the county where he committed the crime. And so he goes to court. And what the court rules here has a really profound impact on convict leasing across the South. The court says that during his term of service in the penitentiary, a prisoner is in a state of penal servitude to the state. He is, for the time being, the slave of the state. And they also rule that prisoners are what they call civilly dead, meaning that they have no rights. They forfeit all their rights except, they said, what humanity accords them. So based on this ruling, Texas, the legislature is going to lease out the entire prison system in 1871 to a Galveston area business group called Ward, Dewey and Company. So Andrew Ward, he'd been in charge of the Arkansas Penitentiary, and then he actually ran off when Civil War Union troops were approaching, and he comes to Texas, and they give him this job of being in charge of the lease. And so Dewey and Company are going to use some of the convicts on their private farms, And then they're going to sublease others to area planters and railroad companies. And they're going to have a 15-year contract. They pay $5,000 a year for the first 5 years, and then it's going to go up to $20,000 a year for the last 5 years. So this is going to not only provide money to the state of Texas, but it also eliminates the expense of operating a prison. And so Ward and Dewey, they're making a lot of money subleasing convicts, and they send a lot of money to the state treasury. But there are so many abuses that they're actually going to lose their lease. There's an investigation by the legislature in 1875, and it's just really shocking abuse that they uncover. And the abuse that really upset the public the most is that there were a group of military prisoners being held there. They get transferred to the federal penitentiary in Kansas, and they had been beaten, abused, starved. Some of them died after they arrived. It makes national news, and it actually shamed the Texas legislature into investigating. So that's why they do. And they find all sorts of horrible things. Several men had been killed in the stocks, which was a form of punishment. They'd been choked to death. One man had less than 17 days left on his sentence when he is killed by having his neck broken. So I'll show you an image. This is some stocks actually in Delaware and a whipping post. But in Texas, the stocks were designed so that you had to stand up on your tiptoes. And if your legs started to give out, then the weight of your body would actually choke you. And that's what happened to that man. And then whipping, guards were supposed to get special permission to whip, but they usually didn't bother getting permission. And by law, lashes were limited to 39, but prison records show inmates given hundreds of lashes at a time. For example, a black convict named John Henry was given 500 lashes, and then he was shot and killed by the guards. 17-year-old black convict in a plantation in Brazoria County was given 604 lashes. And so we have reports of guards kicking and striking and hitting convicts with boards and sticks and rocks, all sorts of unlawful forms of punishment. And they're even more rampant in those lease camps that are outside the walls of Huntsville. The most shocking and cruel punishment, though, uncovered by the committee was the use of something called the horse. And this is a vertical post in the ground, and then there's a pickaxe handle put kind of horizontally into it. And then the convict would be forced to straddle the handle, and they would pull their legs down and chain them to rings in the ground, putting pressure between their legs until they passed out. This is actually the same torture that was used by the Spanish Inquisition. And this is an image, kind of a cutout of a painting of the Spanish Inquisition. The investigation also uncovers shocking sexual abuse of female inmates. And women inmates were not separated from the men. They're housed with them in Huntsville. Several of the women were pregnant. There's one episode where guards arrive in the morning and they find Ward and Dewey passed out drunk and partially unclothed with a bunch of also intoxicated, mostly unclothed female convicts. But any woman that refused their advances were punished. So I'm going to show you, this is an image showing the gates going into Huntsville, the walls, and then the house that you see that's kind of superimposed over there, that's A.J. Ward's house. That's the guy that's leasing the prison. He lived right next door to the prison. And then Dewey had an apartment inside the prison. So in 1876, about 17% of the convicts actually escaped. The death rate is really shocking. Over 109 people died from diseases, mostly malaria, but also measles, smallpox, pneumonia. Guards killed 28 convicts in that year. And even more troubling, 182 men were unaccounted for. They were just missing, and they don't know what happened to them. So by the end of 1876, the Texas legislature decided that Ward and Dewey were too much of a problem, and they took the lease away from them, and they will give it to another company, Cunningham and Ellis. Now they're going to have the lease through 1883. So Edward Cunningham, we have a photograph of him, and Little Barry Ellis, they formed a partnership in 1875 and purchased several thousand acres of land in Fort Bend and Brazoria counties. And they're doing this really just to prepare for winning the lease. That's why they started putting together all of this property. And using convict labor, they're going to create one of the largest sugar plantation systems in the country. And they are going to create what will later become Imperial Sugar in Sugar Land, Texas. Cunningham and Ellis are going to work 1,044 convicts on their plantation, and then they're going to sublease the remaining 1,113 convicts to area planters. And planters paid $3.01 per convict per month to lease convicts. And Cunningham and Ellis leases bringing in close to $74,000 a year to the Texas State Treasury. And they lease convicts all across what they called the Sugar Bowl counties, where they could actually grow sugar cane. So that's Fort Bend, Wharton, Matagorda, and Brazoria counties. The prison system provided the guards, but because those farms are so scattered, those camps, there are very rare inspections, and so abuses are quite common. So there are problems in the camps. In a 2-year period from 1878 to 1880, 256 convicts died from disease and abuse, and 366 escaped. And as the Cunningham and Ellis lease is coming to an end in 1883, the state decides that instead of finding another private company to do the leasing, that they are going to take over leasing convicts themselves. So the state reasons that why should they let a private company take a cut out of the profits when the state can do it and just keep all of the money. So after their lease ends, Cunningham and Ellis will both lease prisoners from the state and continue to use convicts. And this is where this Sugar Land 95 is going to come in. The remains are going to be found at what at the time is Ellis Camp number 1. And this is just an image and showing where the grave and where the remains are found on that property. So while the state takes control over leasing convicts, they also start buying farms that they can work convicts that are not physically fit enough to lease out. The state-owned prison farms are really profitable, and there are several in Fort Bend County. That's going to pave the way for ending the leasing of convicts to private landowners because the state can actually just work them on their own property. We're also coming into what's known as the Progressive Era, which is a period of reform across the country. And there is going to be some focus by progressives on reforming the prison system. And in Texas, they're going to start pushing to end convict leasing. And there are 2 major investigations into the prison, one in 1902 and one in 1910, that are going to uncover a multitude of abuses and corruption. And that's going to really lead to the end of the lease in 1912. So this is from the 1902 investigation. They're going to declare that the lease system is a disgrace and that it should be abolished. And here's a quote. It says, "As a rule, the life of a convict is not as valuable as that of a dog. As evidence thereof, we find that the average life of a convict is 7 years. When men are shot down like dogs and are worked until they drop dead under this system, the people of Texas cannot hope to escape the responsibility for these wrongs. The existing methods are harsh, cruel, inhumane, and unworthy of an enlightened people." Now, in preparation for this shift in 1908, the state is going to purchase 5,200 acre plot of land from Cunningham and Ellis, which was the Imperial Farm. And why would they sell their land? Basically, with convict leasing coming to an end, they know they cannot have the workforce that they need. And so it will be better for them to sell their land to the state, let prisoners continue to grow sugarcane, and then buy the sugarcane from the prison system and process it at their sugar mill. And this is going to be true of most of the farms in the area, they are going to rely on convict land. When they rely on convict labor, they have to sell their land to the state and they become state-owned farms. So even under state control, reports of abuse continue. Prison officials believe that the only way to handle convicts was with the whip, or the bat. They called it the bat as well. One guard said that convicts were, quote, ignorant and vicious. And he went on to say, quote, I do not think that you can control a black convict without a strap. God made a Negro like a dog. Treat him good and he will rear up and put his feet on your clean shirt. No, sir, I do not think you need to treat a Negro mean, but when he misbehaves himself, he has to be whipped. So you can see this just attitude, this holdover from slavery. But the governor of Texas, Governor Oscar Colquitt, oops, I went too far. There he is. He asked the prison board to ban the use of the whip and the bat. And this is in 1912. And he said, quote, before the legislative investigation, the severest brutalities were practiced in the handling and management of prisoners. They were whipped with leather straps 5 feet long, 3 inches wide, and ½ an inch thick upon their naked backs. And as long as I am governor of this state, the bat shall not be used again. And this is an image of the bat. This is actually up in the prison museum in Huntsville. And it's a big leather strap that you can see that's kind of shaped like a baseball bat. Now, after they outlawed the use of the bat, they will switch to other forms of punishment, the dark cell, chains. But that shift in punishment is going to lead to an immediate decrease in the profitability of the prison farms. So there's a lot of complaining about that they can't whip people anymore. But leasing was ending, and the state bought more and more prison farms to work convicts. They're always looking for ways to make money on convict labor. And that, of course, gives the state a reason to arrest more Black men and women. Because of these racialized laws, a larger proportion of African Americans are incarcerated than their actual percentage in the population. And that has a really profound impact because if it's a disproportionately large number of Black people in prison, the view of the public and of law enforcement is that African Americans are more prone to criminality because they look at the prison system and they're like, look how many Black people are in prison. And so that legacy of convict leasing is going to continue into our criminal justice system today. So that's just a brief overview of convict leasing. And now Dr. Graham is going to talk about her work more directly with the Sugar Land 95.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jack. The individual that Dr. Jack mentioned who took wool from the garbage to make a pair of socks, his name was George Barnett. And I'm going to share.
I don't know how I think I need to unshare mine. Hold on. Okay. I'm trying. There we go.
Okay, so this is a letter from the Governor Elijah Peace, and he's trying to find out what happened to some newly freedmen, formerly slaves, what happened to them. And so he wrote to the district clerk to get a status update. The district clerk replied, I'm trying to minimize this. I'm sorry, I'm trying, there's something in the way here. Okay, so the district clerk replied, 5 freedmen that were sent to the penitentiary from this county were convicted at the spring term of 1866 by jury, and for the period of 2 years, I cannot find the papers in their cases. He then goes on to say George Barnett was accused of stealing 2 or 3 pounds of wool that had been taken off a dead sheep and laid in a fenced corner. He acknowledged in court he had taken the wool, but didn't think that any person wanted it or that he was even doing anything wrong. Sam Butler and Rand Kimbrough were said to have stolen 5 or 6 bushels of wheat worth about $1 per bushel. One of them was perfectly innocent of that. M. Hallen's crime was for stealing 20 pounds of cotton. Jacob Falk and Aaron Leary, I can't learn a syllable about, only that the offense was theft and they were sent for the same length of time. This was not uncommon for individuals to like go missing in the system, but you can see how prevalent it was for individuals to be convicted of theft. And when I share information about the Sugar Land 95, you will see how prevalent that is. So let me get to the presentation on the Sugar Land 95. So Sugar Land 95, who are they? By and large, they were laborers. The majority of the Sugar Land 95 who were convicted were laborers at the time of their conviction. Second in line were farmers. So here's a breakdown. And this will, 48 of them were laborers, 11 were farmers. So you can see how they were immediately sent to the fields to work just based on their occupations. This is the age of the Sugar Land 95 when they were convicted. You can see that many of them are in their 20s. We have one individual who was 60 years old. I'm going to circle back around to this man a couple of times, but most of them were 18, 20. The youngest of our Sugar Land 95 was 14 years old. And I am still looking for information on him, but based on the bioarchaeologist doing the analysis, the individual was 14 years old. This is a map of the counties where they were convicted, and most of them are here in this area. We have one as far west as El Paso, but the majority of them were in this area here. The counties with the highest conviction rates, Lavaca, top the list. Then we have Fayette, Guadalupe, and Washington. So the larger these circles are, these are the counties that had the highest number of convictions. There was one from Fort Bend. Nativity, the majority were either listed as Texas or unknown. There were quite a few unknown. We had one from New York, one as far away as Canada. We had one from Georgia, Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, and Mexico even. So what were they convicted of? Don't pay attention to the numbers. This doesn't represent the actual number of individuals convicted, but the largest number, theft and burglary. We have this individual here who was arrested for aiding felons as they were trying to escape the police. We have assault with intent to murder. We have burglary and assault with attempt to murder. Manslaughter, murder, fraud, one sodomy, one rape, one swindling, but by and large, theft and burglary. Age at death. They didn't last long in the system, not at the labor camps anyway. So we have 19-year-olds, mostly 20-year-olds. We have our 60-year-old right here. Causes of death. Escape attempt. Many of them were killed by the guards, and there was one guard, Jay Arnett, who came up repeatedly in our research as having killed our Sugar Land 95 as they tried to escape. Disease was rampant. Many died from pneumonia, sunstroke, and the causes that are listed here, take it with a grain of salt. There is one individual who was listed as dying of sunstroke, but he actually died because he had asthma, and he wasn't treated for that, but it was listed as a sunstroke. Result of amputation of a limb. There was one of our 95 who had his leg amputated, only one. And in our research, we found an individual who died at the camp as a result of amputation of a limb. And so I'm really hopeful that we can identify this individual, but without the ancient DNA analysis, we won't be able to tell his descendants which set of remains belong to him. So the DNA analysis is really important. 2 individuals drowned. One was run over by a tram car. One struck by lightning. Another one, tree fell on him and he died. A lot of congestion. You'll see that rampant all over the place. This is a breakdown of the causes of death for the individuals. And at the top of the list is killed during escape attempt, 13. Next is sunstroke at 11. This is some of the research that we pulled information from. These are conduct registers. And on these registers, it will have the individual's name, their sentence here, their convict number. They have the locations of the camps that they were at. We have Rusk, we have an Ellis camp. And what we're looking for is the last camp. And this is L.A. Ellis. And this individual died September 3rd, 1893, congestion of the brain. And this is, Nash Williams is one of our Sugar Land 95. So this is just an example of some of the archival work that we researched in order to get information for the Sugar Land 95. This is not one of ours because this individual was discharged. This is one of ours. He was killed attempting to escape on March 3rd, 1893. His last camp was our camp, L.A. Ellis. And this is another. This, I believe, is our 60-year-old C.B. Froge, convict number 9967 from Washington County. Let me go back. He died effect of amputation of limb. And this is a census record, another one of the records that we pulled to get information from. This is one of our 95, Alfred Young. He's listed here along with his wife and child in the 1870 census. This is an image of one of our 95 with a gunshot wound to his jaw. So you can see that here, which goes along with what Dr. Jack was saying about the forms of punishment that these individuals received. A little information on one of our 95, Ben Franklin. On 25 May 1888, Ben Franklin was 39 years old when he was convicted in Fayette County, Texas, of assault with intent to murder. An uneducated Black laborer from Missouri, Franklin was 5'3", 5'6" on recorded in other records, and weighed 180 pounds. His habit of life was listed as intemperate, meaning that meant 2 things. Number 1, drink. He was a drinker. And another thing is he had a difficult time controlling his emotions. And he smoked tobacco. He had scars on his left jaw, a scar on the back of his head, a scar on his right shoulder, a scar below his right shoulder blade, 3 scars on his right hip, and toes missing from both of his feet. When Franklin was convicted, he was married with children and his parents were alive. His family lived in LaGrange, Fayette County, Texas. He received a 5-year sentence and was sent to Ellis Camp Number 1 on 12 June 1888. We were able to pull his court documents, cause number 2936. So we were able to see, to read what the judge said, what the attorney said, and what his sentence was. He died on 26 July 1888, 6 weeks after arriving at Ellis Camp. His cause of death is listed as congestive fever. This was the 3rd offense for Ben Franklin. His first offense, he didn't smoke, he didn't drink, he did not have any of these scars when he was first went into the system. Further research was conducted by Jennifer Stock with the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, the Willie Lee Gay chapter, H-Down chapter here in Houston. So we did solicit help from genealogical societies and other genealogists to help with this research, and OGS is one of the organizations who helps with this. This is Ben Franklin's marriage certificate, and you can't see it, but his wife's name was Melinda, and they were listed as freedmen here. So this is one copy of their marriage certificate. More archival research that we use to get information. So this is my 60-year-old, the one who died from a limb amputation. C.B. Froach was 60 years old when he was convicted in Washington County of theft on 10 December 1881. A Black laborer, initially from Georgia, was 5'10" and weighed 160 pounds. He received a 5-year sentence and was sent to the penitentiary on 4 January 1882. He escaped and was recaptured on 20 April 1882. Sometime between 20 April 1882 and his death on 17 June 1882, his leg was amputated. C.B. Froach died at Ellis Camp Number 2 from the effects of a leg amputation. He was married at the time of his conviction and death, and further research was conducted by Nancy Alamini. Even during slavery, if an individual ran away, it was not uncommon for toes to be amputated. If they continued to run away, it was not uncommon for a leg to be amputated. And so this follows the same pattern during the slave era. I'll give you a minute to take a look at this, but these are the names of some of the Sugar Land 95 that we have recovered and are researching right now. The individuals listed in yellow worked at that camp, but we are working to verify whether or not they died at that camp. All of the other individuals are listed as having died at the camp. I don't know if any of these last names ring true for you guys, but if they do, contact me. While you're looking at these names, as I was conducting this research, actually I was conducting research on my own family line. I do make time to do that. And I located my 4th great uncle. And I noticed that he got a 2-year sentence. He served in Huntsville for violating a local ordinance. And so I'm trying to research to find out what that local ordinance was. I ruled out alcohol, it wasn't that. But violating a local ordinance is something like if Fort Bend County requires you to wear a mask during COVID and you refuse to wear a mask, you could be convicted and sent to prison. So I'm trying to find out why my uncle, what ordinance he violated that caused him to serve a 2-year sentence in Huntsville. So his name is not among the 95. So that's who our Sugarland 95 are. Remains samples of the Sugarland 95, bone sample, teeth sample, they have been taken, and they are at the University of Connecticut, where they will conduct ancient DNA analysis on the 95. Well, 74, 72, 74 is what we've identified thus far. Once that analysis has been conducted and we're able to match the names with the individual remains, we have located possible descendants for 3 of the Sugarland 95. I'm hesitant to contact them because I can't tell them which set of remains belongs to them. But once the analysis comes back, we'll contact the individuals. Then we have a geneticist up in the Woodlands who will do a genetic analysis on the living descendants to make sure that they are indeed a match to one of our Sugarland 95. So right now we're waiting for the DNA analysis to be conducted at the University of Connecticut before we move on. And one of the researchers there just received a grant as part of her dissertation that will fund part of the analysis. So that's what I have with the Sugarland 95 and who they are. So back to Miss Angela.
Oh, that was such a wonderful presentation. I'm opening the floor now. If there are any questions that the guests would like to ask of the panelists today. Okay, one of the questions says, how did you get involved with this issue, Helen?
Wow, and this is being recorded, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay, so networking is ever so key. So years ago, I got with this political group, and in this political group, a few of us peeled off, and we started a nonprofit on education reform. From that, the individual became a board member with Fort Bend ISD. And for years, he was trying to get me to run for a position on the board. And for years, I kept saying, no, I don't know what it entails. So there's a board leadership academy that Fort Bend has now. I was in the first cohort. So we spent about 6 to 9 months just shadowing board members and going to Austin and meeting different politicians and dealing with educational initiatives. And so that's how I got to know the Fort Bend school board and individuals there. I started doing genealogy work though when I was a child. My grandfather was born in 1892 and I lived with him. And so my genealogy work started there. My grandmother was born circa 1919. She was born at home with the midwife. They didn't properly record her birth. She was functionally illiterate. And so I would spend Saturdays writing letters for her to her aunts, to her relatives here in Texas. So when this came about, I contacted my board member friends and said, hey, I want to visit the site. So they put me on to someone else within the district. And then that person put me on to someone else. And I just felt like I was just getting the runarounds. So I was going to visit the site one way or another. So I went to Best Buy to buy a drone because I was going to fly it over the site because I was going to visit it. And something just told me to send them your resume. And so I sent them my genealogical resume, said I can be of service to you. And the next day they contacted me and said, hey, when can you come out and visit? So that's how I got involved with this work. And so I was appointed the lead genealogist to do this work and the expert on genealogical work for the Sugarland 95.
Another question that came up, is anyone working on timber industries around Huntsville? Either one of you.
So I've done just a little bit of research when I was writing about convict leasing originally. most of the lumber work was connected to the railroad leases, so they would have a wood camp. And most of those prisoners were white that worked on those wood camps because it was considered less strenuous. There was an accusation by citizens in Mineola, Texas, that convicts were being worked to death and then buried in the railroad tracks. And so that because they were white prisoners, it got a lot of people in that area really cranked up about convict leasing, but not a lot just on the wood industry, no.
Okay, let's see. Another question. Someone asked, how did you guys know where to start looking to gather all the documentation you have in regards to the 95 to associate them as being prisoners at the prison camp? And because you have such great documentation.
Well, I mean, I know that, and I put that in the chat, that most of these records are held at the State Archives in Austin, which is where I did most of my research originally. But when I did my original research, I had to physically go there, and those conduct ledgers like that Helen showed you, they're huge, right? These great big books that are all handwritten, and now they have a lot of them digitized, they're online. But yeah, the prison has records, the individual counties have records of court cases, depending on where they come in the state and if you can have access to them. But most of the records are held in the state archives that are useful to what I was doing. And I'm sure for a lot of what Helen's doing. Freedmen Bureau records, that most of them are online as well.
Yeah, we did spend, we spent a week, but even before then, we had to find out the history of the land. So we had to do title searches to find out who owned the land and what the land was used for. And then when we found out that it was a labor camp, Teresa's research really came in handy in helping us in that area. And then we narrowed down the years of the different names of the camp. And then we had to search those camp names based on the years to find out, to get information there. So we did spend a week in Austin in the state archives, just poring over records, poring over memos and letters and ledgers, trying to find this information. That's how we found my 60-year-old, Seabay Froach. But a lot of the information, the convict ledgers and the registries are on Ancestry.com. So if you have a subscription there, you can take a look at the Texas convict ledgers, and you can get information from there. So I used Ancestry. I used Family Search. Family Search is free. It's the largest genealogical organization in the world. And so I look for records both in Ancestry and Family Search for these individuals. And that's how I was able to find like the marriage record for Ben Franklin and his wife, Melinda, and a lot of other records that you saw today.
Okay. Another question. Someone asked, can someone address the constitutional justifications for convict leasing in this period, such as maybe the 13th Amendment?
There's a loophole. Dr. Jack,
yeah.
Go ahead.
You know, because the 13th Amendment says that you can't enslave someone except if they're duly convicted of a crime. And as I talked about earlier, you know, they criminalize Black behavior. So all of these people were, you know, duly convicted of a crime, whether the crime was a legitimate crime or something that they should have been arrested for, or most likely criminalized behavior. And that's not to say that nobody there had committed a crime, but it's trumped up charges, things that people were doing, and then that behavior was made a crime. And when you're making money off of somebody, you have a reason to arrest them, right? If you can make money off of leasing convicts, then you want more convicts in your system so that you can make more money for the state. And you see it all across the South. So there's some talk, I mean, that there was a documentary about the 13th Amendment that talked about this. And, you know, some people were talking about, oh, we should get rid of the 13th Amendment, which is not really, you know, that's not the solution. But yeah, it's a loophole, and, you know, those Southerners, they figured out a way around it. They want that coerced labor, and they're going to figure out a way to do it.
And also with the children, Teresa talked about children as young as 10. One of the individuals, his name was Beauregard. He listed his age as 12, the guard doing the intake form said he didn't look much older than 10 years old. Some of these families would, we would call them internships today, send their children to learn a trade from someone else, and then they would go missing. And many times they would end up in the system, out in the fields, in prison uniforms during this labor. One individual wrote a letter to the president of the United States at the time saying, you know, her brother, she was trying to locate her brother who was, it wasn't called an internship. Help me out here.
Apprenticeship. An apprenticeship.
Yes, he was apprenticed to an individual and he went missing and she couldn't find her brother. So she wrote the president of the United States trying to find out if he could help her find her brother. So that was common for reasons why so many children ended up in the system.
And
as
those
well.
vagrancy statutes that I mentioned earlier in my presentation, if you as a parent were arrested for vagrancy, the state took your kids because you were a vagrant, and then they would apprentice them out until they were 25 years old picking cotton. So that meant your kid had to work for free until they were 25 because the parents were arrested for vagrancy. And the vagrancy charges, if you were Black and you were not working on a plantation for a white person, any white person in the county could accuse you of being a vagrant and they would just pick you up and take you. And you couldn't defend yourself.
Even if you could, well, even if the fines were, if there were fines imposed, they were so ridiculously high that the individuals could not pay the fines. And so it was like, okay, then you have to work it off.
And they auctioned them. They auctioned them off on the courthouse steps. You know, and in my research, I found a man that had been enslaved on a plantation in Fort Bend County. And then he got arrested for vagrancy, auctioned off, and right back on the same plantation that he had been freed from as a vagrant. So, yeah.
I think you all may have motivated someone to want to be a historian. The question was, what advice will you give to a student that is interested?
Get involved in this work. There's lots of work to be done. Get involved to see if this is something that you really want to do. This sort of work is not for the faint of heart. You read about so many of the atrocities that have taken place, and we haven't even touched on some of the ones that just really shake you to the core.
Yeah.
But get involved in this work. Volunteer with us. See if this is something you really want to do, and go from there.
Yeah, you know, in the Sugar Land 95, I saw a question earlier about what the plan is. Fort Bend ISD is trying to fundraise right now for a museum connected to the site. All of the remains were reinterred back exactly where they had been. And they're trying to identify them, but the plan for the school is to have some sort of a memorial, a museum, information placards that people can go in and learn the history, particularly the students that are taking classes at the Reese Center. It's a difficult site to visit. You know, when they were building the school, a wing of the school was going to go right over where they found the remains. And so they stopped building the school, and, you know, they didn't build that wing, but it is actually right adjacent to the school building, fenced off, and markers for the 95.
And you can visit the site now. Like Dr. Jack said, they have been reinterred, and I was fortunate enough to be there when that was taking place. The archaeologist he started describing how much each of the caskets weighed with the individual's remains in there. And I'm like, okay, that's all good information. And he's like, no, if you want to help reinter one of them, that's why I'm telling you how much they weigh. So I did. It was a sombering experience. My family asked when we went to the site and saw the remains there. Some of them were fully intact. And they asked, was it really creepy? Was it scary? And I'm like, no, the feeling that I got was they were just glad that somebody finally found them after all these years, because the remains date from, like, I think 1871 to 1911.
Mhm.
That's a long time to be lost, to be forgotten.
Yeah.
So we're just fortunate enough that we were able to find them and do some research to find out who they are and who their families are.
And they are doing fundraising for some of that, and they're also doing fundraising to help cover some of the DNA testing of the remains that are in the lab in Connecticut. They got permission from the Texas State Historical Commission to do extractive DNA from molars and some from, I think some of them had to come from leg bones and things, but most of them came from teeth. And so they're trying to get that DNA. And then that way, when Helen and her genealogy people figure out some of the names, they can try and trace forward and have somebody to match that DNA to, so that people can connect. And then they have a plan in place that if somebody does want to reclaim those remains, that they will be able to do that.
Another question was, apologies if this was addressed, but what is the long-term goal for the project?
I identify everybody and have a memorial so that people don't forget, so that people know that prosperity out in Sugar Land, that's built on the backs of these people. And this is one camp out of dozens that were in that area. There's prison farms. I live right by what is Jester Prison now, but at the time was Harlem Prison Farm. We know there's a cemetery out there somewhere, but nobody knows exactly where it's at. So they're, they would bury them, and then they would just, and many times families couldn't afford to claim the remains. It's not that they didn't want them, they couldn't afford to retrieve a body. And these are not people that lived in Fort Bend County. They lived all over the state, and the state did not pay to return remains. And so they would have just a small wooden marker with their convict number on it, and those would disintegrate over time, and grass would grow over it, and people would forget. And there's hundreds and hundreds of bodies out there. Many of them subdivisions built over them now. So
There are. My ultimate goal with the genealogy work is to connect these 95 with their posterity. It's all about connecting them to their families, and so that is my ultimate goal. And Dr. Jack is correct. In our research, we did come across several other camps, and I admit at times I'm a poor researcher because I have what's I term ADOS. It's like attention deficit. Ooh, shiny. It's
Right.
It's like I'm focusing on the Sugar Land 95 camp, but I see other camps and I'm like, I need to record this information so I can get back to it. But she's right here in Fort Bend County. There are others here that we discovered in our research, and I'm sure that there are remains there as well.
Another question, has many parts to it. It says, after all this happened, and pardon my ignorance, were the families in any way apologized to or compensated? I mean, these poor people lost their lives and were terribly treated by the state. I did understand that they were slaves to the state during their imprisonment, but surely there had to be a limit to the punishment they could receive. Was the wrongdoing ever admitted and kind of compensated for?
No. Short answer, no. The state did not apologize. There were some, leasing is wrong, we shouldn't do it. But as far as compensating the families, and when you think about, if you pulled somebody out of a family and arrested them on trumped up charges and they die in one of these prison camps, the generational wealth that is denied that family, right? The husband, the brother, the son is gone. And they can't rely on that help for their family. I mean, it's just but no, the state doesn't apologize. The state doesn't compensate anybody. I think when they get out of prison, if they're lucky enough to survive, they got a new suit of clothes and a few dollars to get a train ticket back home. And that's about it.
But even in one case, and this is in the book Penology for Profit, which is a good book to read, one individual was released from prison. The prison guard gave him a set of clean clothes to wear, and no sooner than he walked out the gate, he was rearrested for theft of those very same clothes that the prison guard gave him. So he was back in the system.
Okay, this is another question and maybe another historian person I'm trying to recruit here. So the question was, how can one keep up with your research work? So both of you could probably answer that. So if someone is interested, they like what you're saying. So they wanted to know, how could they keep up with your research? How could
You
they
can
follow
keep up.
you?
You can
Mhm.
keep up by helping with the research. There's still a lot of research to be done. So contact me and help with the research, and you can stay on top of what's going on. That's the easiest way to keep up with what's going on.
Yeah. And I mean, Helen and I both give a lot of talks. Um, we try to get the word out there. There are a lot of other people that are working on this as well. And I know that at Fort Bend ISD, they have some really committed people that are trying to make sure that the word gets out, and they give interviews and they publish stuff, and there are things on the news and in the newspapers to try and keep up with it. And I hope that people don't forget and it doesn't just kind of fall out of their minds, because this is long-term work, right? That DNA doesn't come. It's not like on CSI or something where you get it the next day. This takes a
Right.
long time to get the DNA extracted, and then to identify people is even longer, so that you have somebody to match that DNA to. So it's
So
going to
you
be
can
years.
contact Fort Bend because they do have a dedicated person that's handling this initiative. So you can contact Fort Bend directly.
Well, thank you, ladies, for your wonderful presentation. It was highly informative, and there are so many great questions that are still here in the chat that they may appear in the recording that you all could address at a future date. And on behalf of the Speakers Committee, I'm thankful for all of the guests that we've had today, and appreciate it. And do come back out for some more of our speaker series in the future. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks for everybody that came.
Yes, thank you.